Hello, my friends. Thank you for being here and for all your supportive comments. I'm nervous now because so many of you are watching the videos. I'm nervous and I also have some bad news. That is, if you remember in the last video, there was a scenario that I had developed where I said that this shell crashed in 2 stages. That means there was a first stage where things happened slowly and then there was an acceleration. Well, that version seems to be confirmed based on the evidence we've found. So that's 2 videos now where I'm telling you things that are being confirmed. I'm just using the same methods I use in airplane accident investigations. On this whole submarine story, which is ultimately a matter of physics and engineering and all that. And if you look at the methods I use in aviation, they've been so effective that in the end, I've even received phone calls sometimes. Hello, my name is Ascent. I was the pilot of the plane that crashed at Aviation. I'd like to talk. I saw your video. Hello, I was the Oceangate interplane's pilot when it crashed. Mediterranean, I watched your video and want to talk. These methods allow you to build a narrative, that relies on points, on data points, thousands of data points. And in the end, it gives us the most probable solution. Because, to tell you the truth, there is no investigation into this flag. In the sense that there isn't. No one. Who's going to spend millions to send a submersible with 2 police officers and a Zurich Ray claims manager to try to understand what happened? That's not going to happen. That won't happen, and I'll explain why. For example, an Air France Airbus A380 once lost part of its engine over Greenland. While the BEA went there, they camped out for weeks. They dug into the ice to find the pieces of that engine. Why? Because there was public interest. Those engines on that plane were everywhere, transporting people worldwide. So it was necessary to really understand what the defects were. But in the case we're interested in, it's an experimental submarine that went too deep. It crashed, so there's really no one who will be interested beyond, let's say, the immediate family. Also, the ships that were there have already left. So today, I'd like to talk to you about what we might call the final scenario of this story. This is the final video on the topic unless future developments arise. I don't think so, but if there are any new developments, I'll make more videos. But I think this is the last one in this series. And we'll switch to aviation right after with a very interesting helicopter story. A helicopter where it was literally spitting out its teeth and spitting out metal. Some people debated replacing parts, but ultimately didn't replace anything. You'll see this in the next video. So today, besides the script, I'd still like to answer a lot of questions. A lot of questions that people ask in the comments. And then the people who contact me also come with interesting questions. Thank you if you come back. In 2018, we were in Thailand. There were 12 kids with an instructor who went into a cave to explore it. They left their bicycles outside and started to discover the wonders of this place. Meanwhile, storms were forming, getting heavier and heavier, and at some point they broke out in the form of torrential rain. These kids who are inside start to hear a rather sinister sound of water trickling, which gets louder and louder. They feel like they're literally inside a toilet that's filling up. So they decide to rush toward the exit. When they get close to it, they realize it's flooded. The water was already cutting off any way to retreat, so they stay in that room, thinking about their options. And then they realize with horror that the water is rising, and it's rising very quickly. We're talking about 1 meter per hour. They realize staying in this room will soon flood it to the ceiling, so they head to the sewing room. The room next door offers them brief respite. Because the water starts coming back, it rises. And then it's as if it knew they were there and came looking for them. So what follows is a frantic race through the bowels of the earth. They will run through corridors, labyrinths, chambers, crawl through bottlenecks, through siphons. And then after 4 kilometers of this frantic race, they arrive in a large chamber and realize that this must be the last one. In fact, it has no other exit, and then behind them, they hear the water coming after them. This water was moving slowly, as if it had all the time in the world, but it was moving steadily. So they climbed a rock in that chamber, and then they watched that dark wave slowly coming toward them. Luckily, it stopped just as it touched their feet again. Outside, an extraordinary human chain had formed. We saw people coming from all over the world, coming from Europe, coming from Asia. We even had Americans who had sent military personnel from Okinawa. We had specialists of all kinds, civilians, military personnel, experts, divers. They set up kilometers of pipes, pumps. They started to drain this cave system. People started diving in search of these children. And do you remember? Practically the whole world followed this story for 3 weeks until the day they were rescued. Those kids weren't billionaires. They didn't pay to train pay. And this answer, if you want this story, I would like to give it to you in response to those who say, yes, we care about billionaires. But if it had been ordinary people, poor people, no one would have cared. These Thai people were poor, and yet the whole world was focused on their case. Why? Actually, I took a class with a certain Jonathan Young, who is a psychologist, a psychiatrist, who was a student of Mr. Campbell, of Joseph Campbell, and both are people who worked on mythology, on the theory of history. Why are some stories passed down from generation to generation, from people to people, while others seem to fade away as soon as they are told? In fact, some stories contain within themselves a certain number of triggers, psychological triggers. They're going to stimulate the certain deep sensitivities. It can be hopes, it can be fears, or even extremely fundamental or ancestral anxieties that are in each of them. These stories are from them. So today I would like to tell you something. I'll come back to the questions later. So if you look at this submarine, when we talked about it last time, I told you there were two options. The first option was this one. The first option was CLAC. It's simply that it's going down. Then, suddenly and brutally, without warning, it was crushed below. That's not what happened. And why? Because actually, according to what's coming out, it's that he was ascending when he imploded. Why ascending? It was an emergency. Because they had signs, they had warning signs that it was going to crash. They felt there was a problem. So in what form this problem appeared, we will probably never know. Chips usually record data, but I'm not sure if IFRIMA or others have recovered any from the ground. I would be surprised if they did, because they found the remains and then they left, that's all. They weren't there to conduct an investigation, but if we see in the document from last time, I'll also tell you at what depth this took place. And you'll see it's quite surprising. That is, let's talk about the depth where this is happening, and then we'll talk a little bit about the scenario. So at first they say that communication was lost at 1:45, which means 1 hour and 45 minutes after the start of the dive. Actually, it's not exactly like that. I'd like to tell you how to interpret this information. Here's how you read it. The Titanic is at 3,800 meters, okay? This submarine takes 120 minutes to get there. It has been to the Titanic many times, and it's at 3,800 meters. It takes 2 hours to descend at a constant linear speed. So, this tells us that at 1 hour and 30 minutes, it was at 2,850 meters, more or less. Okay, 2,850 meters at 1 hour and 30 minutes after the start of the dive. And actually right there, it sent a ping. It was a device that sends a ping every 15 minutes, which is detected at the surface by the vessel meter at 15, 30, and 45 minutes. And each time it's deeper and deeper. The 130 ping was received and corresponds to roughly 2,800 meters deep. The 130-145 ping wasn't received. That ping, that's why we say communication was lost at 145. In fact, that ping was not received. And that ping is roughly at 3,325 meters. All right. You see, there's almost 500 meters between the two pings. So what's happening? Here, we have the submarine that's okay, that's doing fine. Here, it has probably already been destroyed because we didn't receive the ping. So the destruction happened somewhere between these two. That means somewhere here, between these two depths. The device was destroyed. Notice something extraordinary. Usually it goes down to 3,800 meters, but here it was destroyed in the 3,000 meter zone. What does that tell us? That tells us that, in fact, it was weakened. That tells us that it probably already had fractures there. It had a phenomenon of fatigue that had affected the hull. Whether it's the metal part or the carbon fiber part or both. By the way, there are things to say about the carbon part. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And so, it collapsed well before reaching the depth it usually reached. And that's a pretty typical sign of a premature fatigue situation, with probably during the previous dives, so the development of cracks and all that, which could have been detected if they had analyzed the hull each time, but they didn't do it because quite simply it was too expensive. So what happened? They're there. At that point, we probably have, as mentioned in the last video, we probably have cracks that will appear in the carbon fiber section. So the carbon fiber part, where does the carbon fiber come from? He said Stockton is Oceangate's chief executive officer. He said he got it from Boeing. He said Boeing provided him with the fiber and that Boeing even helped him to build or design this submarine. So at first, what's already surprising is that Boeing isn't a well-known brand or a reference when it comes to submarines. As far as I know, they've never made any. So in the market, they're not known for that. We see their logo on a plane, that's fine, but we don't see their logo on submarines. So already their expertise in this area is relatively limited. Secondly, he said that the fiber he received from them was fiber that had expired. That means a fiber that was considered unfit to be used in airplanes, which is already quite worrying because here we're dealing with a structural component. We're not talking about a fairing or mopeds where you might be able to use products you can source elsewhere. And then you think, well, it was rejected by Boeing or rejected by National Aeronautics and Space Administration or someone else. But for my moped, it's fine. Here we have a structural component that's actually important. He claims he sourced it, despite it being unsuitable for aerospace use. I contacted Boeing to ask them if they had worked with this company. So I got a response over the weekend and they told me no, they haven't. They didn't supply this fiber, they did some research and there is no contact or invoice. Whether it's under Mr. Stockton's name or under Oceangate's name saying that they sold him carbon fiber. And even more so since they basically don't sell any. They use it for their planes but they don't supply it. So they say it's not possible, they've never worked with this guy. The idea is that he probably got this fiber through a recycling system in a recycling or surplus circuit. Like, well, he's in contact with someone who tells him, yeah, we have a truckload or a container of fibers. It's probably something that was meant for the aerospace industry, for Boeing or something like that. And then we're going to throw it away simply because it's past the date. So when fiber goes past the date, it's probably something that was considered unfit for use. It was likely stored on a vacant lot, exposed to sun and ultraviolet rays that damaged the fiber. Stored in rusty containers or in places where there was chemical pollution, rain, all that. It was no longer respected because it wasn't going to be used, and this may have lasted 20 years. And from there, when is this fiber going to be thrown away? Mr. Stockton admits he bought it back himself. So, you see the story when we look at the controller he was using for a critical application? It wasn't used to control a GoPro or anything like that, but he actually used it to control his device. Well, the kind of shortcuts he was taking them at every level, including on something as critical as the hull of his device. So, what happens? He gets to the 3,000 meter zones and the hull starts. And here I changed maybe. Last time I made an estimate of 400 kilo per square centimeter. Here I think it would be more appropriate to talk about 300 kilo per square centimeter. It's a much more realistic estimate knowing that our submarine imploded more in the 3,000 meter zone than in the 4,000 meter zone. So here, what we have is that we probably have leaks, water leaks, either through cracks in the fiber or at the interface between the fiber and the metal. Alright, so how could that have shown up for them? It could have appeared as vibrations, whistling, early sheet metal deformation, or a specific noise. And this created an alarm or a sufficient sense of urgency for the pilot, either prompting him to stop going deeper and decide to change his mind and go back up. So at that point, they started dropping the ballast, meaning he literally has construction pipes that are cut into slices which serve as ballast. He started dropping that ballast in order to go back up, and so he began to ascend. And there, despite everything, he made it. He was crushed because, quite simply, the device was severely damaged. And then afterwards, well, this caused everyone's death. So there are people who talked about the porthole. That doesn't seem to be the problem with the porthole in this case, because if the porthole had exploded, it would have gone right through the entire cabin, it would have gone through the screen at the back, and through to the other side, the hemispherical dome at the other end. And then, indeed, water would have rushed in large quantities. And of course, this wouldn't have allowed the pilots to initiate an ascent because it would have been something quite explosive. And so from that point on, our submarine sank. So another question that was asked is why, even though the United States Navy knew from the start and had heard the sound of an implosion, they didn't say anything. So actually, if you look at what's happening in the Atlantic and even on the other side, there's been an underwater war going on since literally the Cold War era, and it continues to this day. Much of the system is kept secret. If you look online, you'll see one of the most visible and spectacular elements of this war. That's the ship called the United States Naval Ship Impeccable. It's a ship that looks like it came straight out of a James Bond movie. It tows behind it a passive sonar that's 1.5 kilometers long. And then there's the tracking of submarines and the sounds that are underwater. So those sounds are picked up. And the goal? And there are microphones everywhere as well, whether it's on this ship or on others, in a system whose purpose precisely is to listen to what happens underwater. When the United States Navy hears a noise like this, will they discuss it or not? That is to say, the program is largely secret. But if they talk about it, they're going to reveal in any case, the performance of these microphones, what they can hear, their placement and all that. So it's true that that's why they hesitated for several days before saying, yes, we heard a noise. It was probably the time it took for it to be declassified, for it to go through the whole hierarchy, for it to be declassified, and for them to say, yes, you can talk about it. So another thing regarding people who say, there are people who say, that could never have happened to me. I don't have $150,000 to pay to risk my life in a submersible. Actually, that might not be a completely valid point in reality, because he doesn't need to pay $250,000 to kill himself. You can find extremely credible options for around €50. We regularly have tourists who talk about it. And that's where I call on everyone's individual responsibility. You shouldn't say that it only happens to others, or that it only happens to billionaires, or that it only happens to people with €250,000. Tourists travel to places like Turkey, Egypt, or Switzerland, where many activities have ended very badly. Remember those kids who got swept away by the water. Remember that plane, that Junker, which crashed into the mountain with lots of tourists inside. See, that didn't happen in Thailand. It was right here in Switzerland. So you have to be careful everywhere. Not just when you go to tourist countries, you have to be careful pretty much everywhere. But I was saying that there are tourists, they go somewhere, they pay $49 per person. And then 2 days later, when the 777 takes off to go home, they're lying in the 777 and they're lying in the cargo hold. And unfortunately, that's something that happens every day. And I'd also like to tell you about that. I'd like to relate that to what they're saying. But what were the authorities doing? Why was it allowed? Why? My friends, if I wanted to get into controversy, I could give you plenty of things that are allowed by the authorities, yet are extremely dangerous, even deadly. But we're not going to go in that direction. I'd like to tell you that you shouldn't believe there's always an official, that there's always a civil servant watching over your safety. You move forward in life and eventually arrive. There are guys on a beach who, for a fee of €20, sell you something, I don't know myself. Going up in a hot air balloon or getting pulled by a boat or something else. It's not because the guys are offering that. There's an official standing there who has checked, validated, tested, and approved it. That's not how it works in life. Here, we're in international waters. If some guys want to get into a kind of glorified gas cylinder and then throw themselves into the Atlantic, there's no administration that's going to set up an official there in the middle of the Atlantic with a desk to validate and certify. So the first certification, that's you. That's often the first line of certification, and despite everything, very often the last as well. I'd also like to address those discussing science. When I said the place is bad, the place is just bad, plain and simple. There have been deaths at that place since 1912, yet no one lives there. You look at that place from the Atlantic, there are 0 inhabitants. It's been 111 years and nothing has changed. There have been more than 1,500 deaths in that place, so I said the place is bad. So if you offered me a submarine today and said everything is absolutely perfect, it has even been certified and all that, and it has already gone to the Titanic 50 times and everything, and you show it for free, I tell you, no, it's not that I don't believe in science. As the mother, or rather the wife of that man who died with his son said, she said, my daughter, her daughter who was on the boat, she said, my daughter trusted all of that because she believed in science. And that unfortunately shows us that in the West, we are increasingly losing the scientific spirit. Science isn't a source of prophecy we just believe in. And then we carry that belief like we would carry a cross or a religious symbol, saying, yes, when it comes to science, I am a believer. No, we don't believe in science. Science is a methodology, a way of working that is just as true, just as fair, and just as well-founded, as are the humans behind it in the end, and knowing that humans are flawed. Alright, so this book that I read to prepare for this video. This book is called Checklist. It's by someone named Alcide Alwande or Kalwande, or wait, Atul Gawande, who is a doctor. Actually, this book was lying around on the ship, on the seaboat. It was apparently one of the bedside books of Mr. Stockton, the submarine pilot. And actually, it's written by a doctor who talks specifically about risks and how we can manage risks with checklists and all that. He's more in the medical field, sometimes talking about things other than submarines. Okay, so it's an interesting book, that's true, but I wonder if it didn't somehow push Mr. Stockton to make some bad decisions. Because in this book it says, yes, the regulators, the people who regulate different industries often don't really know what they're doing. And then they trust. In the end, we often see this in aviation. It's like the FAA, for example, which lets Boeing do its own tests and all that. They say, you did the tests, it's good, we approve, thank you. So him. He believed, Mr. Stockton, that he could go it alone and fully disconnect from the industry and then work according to his own judgment. And unfortunately, there are people who say yes, but he pushed exploration and all that. No, he didn't push anything, actually. That is to say, the profession of submariner is a relatively mature profession today. If you build a plane now, I put 5 people in it, we take off, and then a wing breaks and we die. You can't say he advanced aviation because that's not true. That excuse might have worked 100 years ago, but not today, because today we have so much more. Many aspects of aviation are mature now, and that maturity actually rules out any excuse for that. So, when we go in a submarine and get crushed by the water these days, it's true that it's a bit, yes, it's silly since the risk is controlled and the material's strength is usually well known, and there's no reason to get crushed unless other problems arise. I get it, but getting crushed because of a bad calculation, yeah, that's true. It's not great. Some people talk about bubbles. Did any bubbles rise up? No, there weren't any bubbles that came up to the surface. Probably just because, quite simply. We have a volume inside this submarine. Once that volume is at atmospheric pressure, once the volume is crushed, that means if we have 300 bar, let's say we have 3 cubic meters, let's say 3,000 liters of volume inside the submersible. I'm not sure of the exact volume, but this gives you an idea. Well, if suddenly that volume is open to 300 bar of water pressure, well, what's going to happen? What will happen? Because air is compressible, its volume will shrink by a factor of 10, so we'll reach 300. That means we'll go from 3,000 liters of volume immediately to that air being contained in 10 liters. So with 6,000 liters, we'll end up with 20 liters. That's all there is to it. that air will be compressed very abruptly. That air will dissolve in the water. Because we're used to seeing sugar or other things dissolve in drinks, in tea, in coffee, or something else. But in reality, there is also gas that dissolves in water. Let me show you this. This is a bottle. It's closed. It's under pressure. And actually, there's gas dissolved in there. If I open it, it's going to fizz. I don't want to get splashed. Look at what happens. Look at what happens. All right. You see bubbles. You see bubbles forming. You see bubbles. And actually, why does this happen? It's simply because we have gas that's dissolved in the water. So when we get there, the higher the pressure, the more gas we can dissolve. So if we have 20, 25, or 30 liters of air gas, in fact, at that depth, it's likely that it will dissolve fairly quickly in the water and that we won't see it. We won't imagine that there are bubbles, bad alloys that will rise to the surface. That's something that won't happen. All right, then, that's the story. It's unfortunate, but it's not necessary for it to happen. But in any case, be very careful. Always remember that you are the first and last line of safety, and that it won't always be scientific, You walk into a restaurant, and you don't like it. Your instincts tell you that it's not good, that you're not going to eat here. Well, you don't eat. You can't go and do detailed chemical analyses on that restaurant to find out that their food is toxic, for example. That will be done once you've experienced something there. There's an investigation and everything, and the investigation report is scientific. When someone actually falls, that's when it gets scientific. And in analysis, but before that, you won't have the opportunity to do scientific analyses. You come if you feel that something's not right, if you feel there's a problem. It's like there are people who were supposed to go on this submarine, who were supposed to pay and leave. They said no, they canceled. They said we're not going. Why? That's their moment. They don't have the ability to do scientific analysis and develop it into a structured theory with a report, data, and graphs. That's not how it works in life, but it works. By simply trusting your instincts, your nose. And you have to develop your nose for that. Because we've been conditioned by millions of years of evolution to detect danger, and you shouldn't intellectualize that, otherwise you end up blinded to danger. There you go, my friends. Thank you for watching this video. Next time, it will be about a story of the Mikos. I'm working on the minimum wage. See you soon. Thanks for watching. Next time, a story of the Mikos. I'm working on the minimum wage. See you soon.